理想の世界の中で叫ぶ有望者と現実世界に追われ叫ぶ絶望者の理想の世界に迫る君は有望者で現実世界に迫る僕は絶望者でご機嫌そうに笑う僕が憎いんです錆びついた音頭ん中で響いてる絶望さは歌う君に憧れ僕の日を忘れて世界を照らす君のメロディー憧れて歌う君の世界を照らす君のメロディー僕は君になれないけど
Hello, hello. Welcome to the stream. Anyone who happens to be here live, thank you so much for being here. And to anybody who's watching this in post, which will probably be most of you, thank you so much for joining. Welcome to the TheBlueShifting, and welcome to the rap party of Mamiya. Now, the name rap party, I think I've mentioned this before, but just a refresher. Rap party, when I worked for the school newspaper back in school, obviously, a rap party was what we called the last night before we set out for publication, kind of before we were absolutely done with all of our work and it was like going to be off in the printers, and then the next day we were going to be seeing distribution start. For us writers and editors, it was essentially cram night. Thankfully, rap party is a lot as stressful as that, but it kind of is similar. I've sat back, I've reviewed some of my notes and thoughts about the series, Mamiya in this case. I had myself a nice dinner, and we used to do pizza parties. Now I just kind of make myself something that seems delicious, and now I get to sit down and I'm just going to kind of review my thoughts in the game as a whole. So if anyone who is in chat, please just leave a comment. You know, I can probably interact with you directly. If you have a question or have something you want me to address or a comment on something I share, I will, respond to you. If you're watching this in post, please also leave a comment here. I don't always get notifications for them, but I would love to interact with you any way I can. And then keep in mind, this is going to be a no-bar, spoiler-filled talk. So if you have somehow stumbled upon this and have not played and read the Mamiya story, please make sure you don't listen to any more until you go and finish it. I didn't cover everything in my playthrough. I typically don't. However, I went back and saw everything, and I will be talking about it. So if you want to keep yourself abreast of that and not be spoiled, now's the time to bow out. Otherwise, kick back and, I don't know, let's keep this kind of chill. To be honest, this has been an emotional series, an emotional game. It's designed to be so. But it highlights on a lot of topics I think are really important and things I've had to spend a lot more time thinking about than I really intended. So this story became a lot more meaningful to me as we went, which is usually the case. But it's another great example of a towering pillar of incredible storytelling. This one's going to have to get slotted right up there with Seabed as one of my favorite visual novels I've ever covered. That's including, the mainstream titles that I see on the channel all the time, which is again a highlight of why Fridays are so special to me. I slated Fridays a long time ago to be for the coverage of games and titles that aren't massively requested, that aren't typically super well known, many times maybe newer titles, because I wanted to show support for creators who maybe don't normally get the limelight, who might get a little overlooked, and who are trying to make a name for themselves. Because that's, for one thing, as a small creator, I understand that perspective. I'm very proud of the channel and how it's grown, and I hope it continues to grow, and I'm going to do everything in my power to foster that. But I'm still a very small fish in a very, very, very big ocean. And so I understand how meaningful it is when a title is carried by even a smaller creator, because everyone wants to see people play Muv-Luv and Steins;Gate, but not everyone really even knows Mamiya or games like it exist. So I'm grateful to cover it, and I will always continue to do so. As long as I'm making content, I'm always going to make room for stuff like this, because then you find these amazing gems of stories that just kind of come out of the blue and slap you around the face a bit and kind of remind you that there's beauty in life, and that even in a simplified form, in something that's smaller, maybe not as epic and grand scale as some of the other major visual novel titles, that there's still something very powerful and needed to be said. So as I go through this, keep in mind that I have every respect for this series, and I will be highly recommending it in the future. I also am really looking forward to, I had a bit of understanding kind of sent to me towards the end of the series that there is technically a third part that's supposed to be coming out. The creator hasn't published it yet. These two parts, I think, came out in tandem together, like they're bundled together in this game. I don't know if that initially was how it was released. Perhaps there was like a Kickstarter or something. Again, a lot of times when something originates in Japan, it's not easy for me to look up their history without accidentally spoiling myself. And so I don't know everything about this, but it's become clear that there is another part coming, and I frankly would love to cover it once it does come out. I want to see a resolution, a true resolution to the story. But even as a standalone, even if where it left off, despite it being an obvious cliffhanger, even if that was like the extent of it, I still think it would be a beautiful story and worth telling and worth like being a part of. Sometimes a story doesn't need to have an ending in order to be meaningful, and the Mamiya is definitely one of them, where if I never find out what happens next, I'll be a little disappointed, sure, but I won't feel cheapened. Like, I won't feel like that my time was unmerited or unfulfilled, which is a beautiful thing to be able to say. So, in the grand scheme of things, fantastic stories and fantastic character development, a great understanding of human beings and the weakness that is inherent in all of us. Again, I ended up going on my own kind of emotional journey. A journey I'm still kind of going through, processing like very complex emotions and burdens that I've never had to encounter before. And so this game was really powerful for me because the characters all had to face their own versions of things that I am currently facing. Granted, they have a much deeper, darker story to share in many respects, but it's hard not to relate to this in one way or another. So I'm grateful for that. Anyway, thank you if you're still listening. I'm done rambling about it. I think I'll talk about more specifics as we go into this. I'm anticipating this to be a quieter evening, and even the music, like, while it gets a little peppy, the music's beautiful, by the way. All the music that's supplied for this is, if you don't recognize it, is just from the game. Audio captured and I'm using because it sets the tone so well. So I'm going to go through each of the characters, and obviously I'll make references to characters like because they relate so powerfully with each other. So you'll hear me talk about them, but I'm going to kind of go through each one, and I'm going to go through their stories just a little bit and kind of just break it down. Just the things I noticed and the things that stood out to me, maybe even the things that bothered me. There were a few. So we're going to just start with there. And I think I have to start with the character with whom I felt the most bond with. That was Tojo Minato. So Minato's story is really interesting because Minato's story is about identity, about what identity is, what it means, and its meaning for the individual. It doesn't even focus so much on the societal part. It just focused on how society's reflection on a person's image impacts the individual, which I thought was really interesting. It wasn't talking about politicals, or it wasn't talking about like stances and acceptance. It was actually talking about self-acceptance and self-standards and personal interpretations and feelings. It touched on the fact that like the feelings of others, casually mentioned even, have an impact on how we interpret ourselves, but that was the extent of it. I thought that was really beautiful because it shows that it is a mature and conscious breakdown of individual challenges. Not to minimize the social challenges that somebody faces, especially when they're a member of the LGBT, what am I talking about? LGBTQ community. What it instead focused on was the struggle of understanding oneself. And I thought that that was very beautiful and important to cover and to highlight. And I think one of the things that we need to remember is that Minato Minato just wanted to be comfortable and happy. And I don't even know to this day, based on the game, like if Minato were here, if Minato would want me to refer to him as him or her as her. And I don't know if he or she ever really understood that themselves. Like, I think they just wanted to know their own place and to have their own place. And it was beautiful to watch because Minato was such an empathetic person. Was able to see into others' hearts and understand and kind of feel their feeling. And even as Mina, like, became so popular because of those traits and qualities of being such a, like, empathetic person. And that's something that I do have experience with. I've often seen similar reactions and had similar thought processes that were broken down through the stories with Minato. Whilst I don't face the same identity crisis per se, I do feel in almost every other respect that Minato and I are very similar. And so, whilst it wasn't the first story I covered, I think it was the one that hit the hardest. It also helps that I have been seeing friends and family who are struggling with identity and who I have been able to talk to about it and be able to kind of understand on that ground level, at least somewhat, some of the challenges that they faced and the burdens that they've had to deal with. And so, like, being able to be able to empathize and feel about that was so powerful for me, and being able to experience that on that level. And then to see how Toma interacted with Minato. It's interesting because the cross interaction between what I'll call like the cult of Mamiya, which were the kind of the predecessors that we learn about in Downfall, and the like band of friends that we initially associate ourselves with. Toma seemed to have the least direct influence on their, I would call them charge, their understudy. Minato and Toma, their bond was through music and like expression. And what Toma seemed to do was be planting the seed of like self-expression and not feeling ashamed of yourself and who you are, which is interesting because it's something that is so positive. Like it was described later that Mamiya was seen as a positive force, and that seed of Mamiya started out as a positive force, and yet it led Minato down a path of destruction because these desires got twisted and turned into a kind of cataclysmic, self-conflicting like spiral, which is all too real and all too like actual in real life. So it was not as easy to be frustrated with Toma as to just be frustrated with the lack of help. The fact that Toma apparently made such a big impression and then also kind of did what Mamiya did and just left, abandoning Minato, knowing that Minato had become dependent on him, and Mamiya as a concept, and then being abandoned. It's like they perpetuated the exact same thing that they went through, which is kind of what the point was with the cult. So I'm sure we'll talk about that more, but Minato, first-rate story, first-rate character. I did like how I was able to suss out that Minato and Mina were the same just before the actual reveal, but up until then, I had no idea. And I thought Mina was such a great character, and I was really excited to see more about her. And then to realize that I'd actually been following Mina this whole time and had actually enjoyed Mina as Minato was really cool and a really fun reveal. It was one of my favorite moments in the playthrough. So if I had to pick a favorite character, it would probably be Tojo Minato. The second favorite, the most impressionable character was Kikuchi Ryo. Ryo's story is really passionate because of the bond that Ryo represents of family. With his little sister, and like how he's determined to try and protect her, and from his very abusive, manipulative mother. Ryo is also interesting because whilst he is like a kind of a beacon of like protection and care and like thoughtfulness, he also suffers from just an edge of violence and an edge of like I don't know, like destruction. It's like he's addicted to fighting, and he's good at it. And I can understand a little bit about like being drawn to something that you are good at and naturally have talent for. But, you know, physicality and physical conflict isn't really something I've ever assumed could be like almost addictive. But I mean, there's a lot of solid evidence out there to say that it could be. It's just something that's so far removed from me, that's a bit hard for me to relate to, but I can strongly relate to wanting to have those familiar bonds. The thing is, like, I can't even relate to on principle, because I grew up with a great family background and great family just interactions in general. And so, because of that, seeing that desire for like a real family structure, it hurts so much, because it's something that you take for granted when you have it, and then when you don't, it's something that you know is missing. And like, it's never the fault of children. Like I said, I even had a title for this section. I said, like, children don't choose their parents, and it's true. Like, you can have children regardless of whether you're ready for it, regardless whether you're worthy of it, regardless whether you can handle it. And those children are your responsibility, and they don't have anyone else they can really turn to. And so it sucks to see the results of parenting that is dismissive and disingenuous and hurtful. And there's like, it's one thing to have like a lapse in judgment. It's one thing to have like a breakdown. Like, I think all parents have breaking points where they just need to step away for a bit. And usually that means getting a babysitter, or like getting upset and then apologizing. I think that's a natural course of being a person, regardless, because parents aren't perfect, and like to expect that is silly. But to be so dismissive and destructive towards your family, to be so like antagonistic, hurtful, physically, mentally, and emotionally, it's painful just to watch. And what's sad is that, like, when reflecting on it, I remember, like, I'd seen it in the past, and I ended up rewatching some of like clips from documentaries of police encounters and police activities, where like they would get a concerned phone call from a neighbor saying that they were worried about children in a home, and they'd go and do a wellness check, and they'd find like children being just kind of left in squalor, like diapers that had like long been pooped and peed in and were just being left in there, parents who were asleep while the children are just like left and locked in a room with a bunch of toys and a TV. You know, like, I understand like kids like enjoy technology, enjoy movies and stuff, but like to literally just lock them away so you don't have to deal with them anymore, and to do that on such a consistent basis is like, it's horrible. But it happens so much, like so much more than you probably think. Like, I don't think it's bad parenting to like need to have space and to like the need to have a break every once in a while, but like there are cases where it's just so hurtful, because it's like these kids don't even understand how wrong some of that treatment can be. They just accept it because that's just the way that their life is. And Rio's story is one that you can't look at and not feel like a bitter taste in your mouth, because of how much pain there is there. And what's interesting is his connection to Arisugawa. Arisugawa's like tale in general, he's, I think, one of the most impactful of the cult when it comes to all the story. So we'll talk about him in depth, but he's the one that has the direct tie and made the connection of Mamiya to Rio. And it's sad because you know how that connection was formed? That connection was formed because he just kind of became a father-like figure temporarily. He was somebody who like spent some time with Rio's mom, discovered Rio was in the house, and like spent some time to take Rio places, to like get to know him, give him stories, help encourage him to think for himself and to like perform in school, to invite him to follow his heart and his dreams, and to like to have experiences, to be selfish and to listen to his own like desires, which like are good things if not taken in excess, which is exactly what Mamiya ends up doing. Like, Mamiya takes things that by principle are good, but then by abandoning the individuals, it turns these like good experiences into an addiction, like an emotional addiction, and twists them up inside, which is really fascinating. It's really odd because the parallel of playing this with Persona is like, you feel like you're looking at people like making palaces, but in Persona, where it's like a cartoony type place where you can go and like rip those desires apart. Like, this is looking at somebody like how do people really get twisted up? Like, there's a lot of fancifulness about these stories, but yet again, there's kernels of reality in there that are just undeniable, and it's really interesting. So Ryo's protectiveness and father-like figure for his sister, meanwhile having that strong burning desire for a father figure that he had a glimpse of, but then walked away and abandoned him, almost making it more painful than having not known his father to begin with and desiring to know what a father was like. It really sucks. It's really painful to even imagine. And so there's another reason why, that's the main reason why Ryo's story stuck out to me. Like, while I couldn't empathize so much with his desire, and while I haven't experienced what he's experienced, I definitely understood the core values and the hunger that he was feeling, and I felt genuine sorrow having seen my share of dysfunctional families, both like documented and in real life. Yeah, it certainly is one that makes you want to not be to be a good father and be a good like brother and sister. You know, like to be there, knowing how meaningful it can be, even if it seems so small. And that kind of brings up to Morichika Haruki, because Haruki, I think, has a lot of similar drive, because like his whole thing is about surface physicality. He's very much like, he's a vagrant who travels around, but he just sleeps with random people and kind of uses that to like leech off a living, where he doesn't value his physical intimacy at all. Like it's a currency. It buys him food and shelter and company. And so he uses his body as a mode of like currency, and he doesn't have a problem with that because he's just always believed that that's where his greatest value lies. Like, not always, I guess. When he was younger, he just felt like a burden and felt like he didn't contribute anything. That there was nothing that made him special, and he had no friends. And that confusion, that alienation that came from being a sickly child was bandaged by Nigaki, who was a nurse at the hospital where he was being treated. And she had some of the most direct puppetation of him because she saw a kindred spirit. And so she told him the Mamiya lie and the Mamiya story, and brought about this powerful connection because she always felt like she had been used and was seen as something of value to be seized. And then she kind of passed on that same principle, but turned on its head to Haruki. And so, like, to take this idea that Haruki's value comes from his ability to please people ultimately made all his interactions feel hollow, because even when he started to have an actual bond with somebody, with Mina, he constantly doubted its veracity, its reality, because he didn't understand nor have just a concept. Like, to him, people used each other. That's just what they did. And so when Mina was so understanding, putting up boundaries, and yet like making room for him in her life, it was something that he found was appealing and warm. But then Mamiya kind of reminded him of his emotions, what he'd been taught his value was, which was non-existent. And it immediately brought the chill back. Because like Nigaki, they both felt like the way people see them was the value that was there, in like defiance of the value that they wanted to see in themselves and what they wanted. And then we come to last, the most confusing character, Suo Kato. Suo, what a nightmare. Like, his is the first story, and I think that was definitely intentional. Like, it's what we're introduced to. But his is also like the most inconsistent story. His has the greatest like hints placed inside the works, and like there's the oddity and just like alien atmosphere to his story in so many ways that makes it different. Like, let's just count the basic surface ways that things are different for Suo. Suo's story is the only one that where he doesn't really seem to know Natsume. Like, he kind of says multiple times, like, he wanted to know who Natsume was, but, like, he also kind of seems confused as to, like, why he's there at the funeral. Which should have been a huge red flag, but we didn't really know what we were looking for. He's also the only one who hears Mamiya, but doesn't actually see anything. You know, which is really different. And then, like, he's also, like, the only one with whom seems to have... He has that interaction where somebody else seems to say that Mamiya's mine at one point. At the end of his story, or in the mid part of his story, like, he feels like he gets attacked by somebody who's saying, like, Mamiya's mine. He's the only one that had an interaction like that of any kind. And yet, he's also the only time, like, we saw Samajima in his story having no idea how important he was going to be down the road. You know, he just kind of seemed like this odd character, just kind of popped up eventually and, like, kind of was encouraging Suo to, like, follow his heart, which seems so nice. But then, like, again, it's like there's that twisting that's always there, right? And it's just so interesting because, like, absolutely pulled the wool over my eyes. I did not make any direct connection that Suo was super different, other than the fact that there was just something that made me uncomfortable about him. In his story with Natsume, like, he effectively just started controlling every aspect of Natsume's life. Like, he kind of became a puppet master, and I said it was like he was like an emotional abuser. Everyone else had actually positive like relationships with Natsume as they went down their paths, but Suo was like the opposite. It was such an unhealthy relationship where Natsume kind of entered a almost Stockholm Syndrome type of scenario where he just kind of kept hanging around because Suo wouldn't let him leave. I mean, would Suo have, like, physically restrained him? No. But Suo kind of would imply, like, bad things were going to happen to him if he left. Like, Suo would get hurt or do something foolish. And it's just... it's interesting. I really didn't like Suo's story. It's hard to, like, dislike Suo as a character because he's just so affable, lovable, but then at the same time, like, you look at the way he behaves and, like, his motivations, and it's just hard not to be creeped out by him. And now we know from the ending, the true ending, which we got, is the freaking guy isn't even, like, real, kind of. Like, he's not really there, or he is there, but he's not from that time period. It's very confusing. I don't know. I gotta figure out how that's all tied together because, like, apparently the interfering somehow pulled Suo from one end of the world to a different one and got him mixed up in all these affairs somehow. There's some kind of connection there. Like, we know he was involved somewhat with, like, the early times, like the 1999 timeline, because, like, there's a direct reference, and this is something we didn't see, but when I went with Samajima's past, which I'll talk about more in a bit, but in that past we get a direct reference of Suo, not by name, but it's very clearly a reference to him. So he obviously is around, and seems like he's about the same age that we see him interacting with Samajima. So, like, how did he end up with, like, Ryo and, like, Minato and Natsume, like, at all? Like, it's really odd. It's really, really, really odd. I just don't know. It's crazy to me. So yeah, I don't know where I stand with him, other than the fact that, like, it blows my mind that whole storyline, freaking crazy cool. Still the creepiest character in the entire game, honestly. And that's saying a lot. There's a lot of creepy people in this. So now I want to go back to the Cult of Mamiya. This is going to be a bit shorter because I want to talk about just, like, their backstories a bit and, like, how they got started. But, like, when I say the Cult of Mamiya, remember, they all kind of made a pact to, like, make Mamiya continue to exist. Essentially, they wanted to reinvent Mamiya, bring Mamiya back to the world because they were so dependent on it as an entity. So they determined to bring it back. And that's the cult. The cult is that they took Mamiya into themselves and tried to become Mamiya. and then use that influence to kind of plant the seeds for the future Mamiyas, which seems to be working, which is insane. So yeah, we're going to be going back, going to talk about that, but the video, by the way, is going to start looping again, because we're at the very end, so it's going to start playing back at the beginning again. Just, like, it'll be quieter, but if it's distracting, let me know if you're here watching. So, we have Nigaki, which is the story I followed. Oh, talk about heavy-handed storytelling, because good grief, her story literally is all about, like, people, like, captivated by her beauty and taking what they want from her. Like, her whole life is just constant sexual harassment of various degrees. Like, it's pretty heavily implied that, like, the sexual harassment went pretty far. And then, like, it's one of those things, too, where, like, she just felt like it was just the way things were. How she couldn't really say anything about it. Even when she was older. Like, she just accepted it. And it really calls out to this idea of, like, how many people, like, facing those challenges who choose or feel unable to report it, or unable to get, like, justice for it. You know, like, it's pretty terrible. Heck, there was even, like, a case recently where, like, a woman, like, so, regardless of whether or not she committed a crime, it just seems kind of odd that, like, she was indicted of a crime, claiming that her DNA had been found at a crime scene, and the DNA that was in the system was from a rape kit that she submitted when she was younger, from the time she got raped. It's like, the person, they never caught or persecuted the person who raped her, but she was then prosecuted on evidence that was seized from her submitted kit when she tried to get justice for herself. And it's like, there's just someone backwards to that, and it's kind of similar to Nigaki's story. YouTube's probably gonna shut this down because I've said the word, but I mean, it's what it is. Like it's just disgusting, and it highlights this, like, attitude of, like, there are people who just feel like they're entitled to that kind of stuff. And can you imagine living and growing up feeling like you're supposed to be this perfect individual and having that taken from you? And, like, when you try and explain that to your mom just tells you, like, no, you're perfect and pretty, you need to be pretty, and, like, go model and, like, be the me that I wish I could have been, you know, let me live through you vicariously, and, like, everything's perfect and you're perfect and you're never going to let that not be the case, right? Like, it's just really sad. Really, really, really sad. And so it's just been fascinating to, like, to see her story, and I really felt for her. And I thought that she and Mamiya had some of the best relationship, like original Mamiya, before, like, the resurrection or whatever the cult brought together. Like, the Mamiya that she knew as the chemistry teacher. Like, their interactions were just really wholesome, and it was like, wow, like, it took that long for her to have a positive male role model in her life, and it wasn't even, like, an actual person, sadly. I get why she was so desperate for Mamiya. I get it. And it's like seeing him interact as, like, a teacher figure who would, like, you know, live, like, be there for her and care for her as a person, not for her beauty and out of, like, a lust of any kind. Because I bet you there were plenty of guys who weren't gonna take advantage of her or anything, but still, like, were primarily interested in her because of her beauty. So in a way, like, I think exceptional beauty could be a curse. I mean, granted, it's not the worst curse, but I also think that there's a lot to be said about, like, the trials and troubles that somebody would, like Nigaki would be going through, and how compassionate others would be. Because how would you explain, like, I'm really pretty and people take advantage of me because of my beauty? It's like complaining you have too much money, and you, like, and it's hard, like, because, like, here's the reality of, like, people who are really wealthy. It's hard for them to have real friends, because oftentimes the people who are, like, around them tend to ask for stuff. I remember talking to somebody who was exceptionally wealthy, and now he had, like, 4 or 5, like, nieces and nephews who were living in his house who were just having trouble or didn't want to be around their family anymore, and so, like, they came and lived with him, and, like, they'd use his cars and his boats and his big house and mansions and stuff, and, like, just essentially just live off his dime. because he had a lot of money. And because he was a caring individual, he didn't turn them away. But like, he also knew they were absolutely taking advantage of him, that they had no real interest in him or his life. They had no like notion of ever trying to pay him back or somehow to like make like use the situation to like help themselves move on. They were just wanting to continue living a life of carefree like excitements, you know, and youth. You know, they were like college age kids who weren't going to college. They were just like bumming off of their rich uncle. And it's like he expressed, he's just like, I know that they are using me, and it's hard to really feel like they care about me as a family member, but I can't just turn my back on them. And it's like, I think it's the same problem that you have with friends. Like, I think celebrities have this problem too. It's like, are people genuinely wanting to understand and be friends with you? Or are they just have they fallen in love with the persona that you put out on TV, on stage, on YouTube? It's a problem I doubt I'll ever have to face, but it's not one I'd look forward to if I did. And it's also one I think people don't get sympathy. I don't have much sympathy for, because despite the fact that people don't ask for those types of challenges, the fact that they have so much going for them and so much like privilege and opportunity because of their position, it's hard to be sympathetic, which I get, but it doesn't mean that those feelings aren't real and those challenges aren't real. And so it's just something to think about. And like Migaki's story is a perfect example of it, which is really interesting because that's not a point of view you often hear. Toma is really interesting. He's kind of like a normal kid who just has big dreams and like wants to pursue his interests in lieu of his father's expectations. It's very traditional, like you see, like there's always the stereotypes, which, I mean, it's not healthy to rely on them, but like a big reason why they're there is because there's a lot of truth for a lot of people. Like there's a stereotype for Asian families, but I think it's all families, where the parents have really high expectations of their children. They expect them to excel, whether academically or otherwise. Usually, ultimately, it's about getting a good job. You know, want their kids to be doctors or lawyers or something, you know? And that pressure, whether intended or not, often gets put on the shoulders of the children, who feel like maybe they're like that they have to do that. And I felt that pressure before. Luckily, my parents weren't super insistent, and they weren't like super disappointed per se, but I built into myself high expectations, and when I haven't been able to meet them, I feel ashamed of that. And it's hard for me to talk to my family sometimes because I feel that shame. It's not really fair or rational, but it's real. And Toma's story is about that, facing that disappointment whilst juggling his own passion and love of music. And Mamiya helps him decide that it's okay to pursue a passion. It's okay to feel something. Because Mamiya appeared in the form of like a classmate who loved astronomy, which is something I was like, yeah, I love astronomy too. And so like Mamiya appeared that way, and he used that to kind of help open his eyes and say like, look, the universe is big enough for people to not all be doctors and lawyers. That there's room for musicians. There's room for people to follow their hearts and passions. And so when abandoned, Toma kind of stuck to that dream and ended up being a music teacher. And that's how he ended up meeting Minato. And they wrote a song together. Or like Minato, or he wrote a song and asked Minato to sing it, and that's kind of where that seed gets planted for Minato. Which, by the way, is interesting because like when you go down the path of Samajima, which I'm going to talk about now, who's the one who bonds with Suo, normally you get kind of like an insight on the other side where you kind of see like how the cult member met like one of the main cast. But when you do Samajima's, it just shows you Toma and Minato's story, even though it also shows you Toma and Minato's story when connected to Samajima, which is just interesting. It's interesting that like the writer decided that the Toma Minato story was the one they wanted to tell twice, when it was actually kind of the simplest and shortest. Maybe that was why. Samajima, oh boy. So like, I said Suo was creepy. Samajima is also very creepy. He's a freaking psychopath. So he works as a cop, but he has no real sense of empathy at all. Like, he doesn't comprehend other people's emotions. He can't. And so, like, he kind of gets to a breaking point where he just decides to take control, and he literally goes to kidnap and murder a child. Like, he plans it all in his head and executes it, like, on a whim. But the child he captures is Mamiya, and Mamiya's deal with him is saying, like, hey, you can do whatever you want to me, just don't, I can be, like, your plaything. And so he just, effectively, cuts, destroys, and kills Mamiya over and over and over, and Mamiya just keeps coming back. Like, he spends time torturing him and examining and, like, pulling him apart and putting him back together, essentially. And, like, until Mamiya helps him to, like, understand how to interact with people. Like, I kind of get that Mamiya was trying to save him from, like, actually being a murderer. But, like, literally, like, offering himself up as, like, a flesh doll to, like, outlet his rage. It's, like, it's so much more disturbing than what Natsumi did for Ryo. Because Ryo, like, you know, like, they would beat on each other as a way to kind of get his aggression out. But this case is so much more, like, disturbing. Of him, like, killing Mamiya over and over again to kind of sate this, like, weird bloodlust he had. Ugh. Good timing for that sound effect to play. So yeah, Samijima and Suo. They're both terrifying. They're both gross. They're both freaky, and they're match made in heaven. Like, it's obvious why they're tied together, but they're also the ones that seem to cut through time in some weird way. So, yeah, I just don't know. It's really odd, and I'm not really sure how that's going to play out exactly, but I'm interested to find it. I'm interested to see how that's all going to work out. And then the last of the cult members, Arisugawa, he's kind of like the seed of the cult itself. He's the author, so he wrote books. What Mamiya helped him do was Mamiya appeared as a girl at a bar he would attend to catch his eye. And she motivated him to switch from just trying to write general fantasy novels into children's novels, because the premise he would write was very fanciful and very ideal, which just didn't fit a lot of narratives that were targeting older audiences. But when he changed his writing style just a little bit, it ended up being a really good fit for child and youth books. And so he ended up becoming a writer and not having to shelve his dreams and being able to follow his heart and trying to, like, change the world. And then she eventually, like, he talked about how, like, he saw himself eventually proposing to Mamiya because, like, she was just such an integral part of his life and, like, who he'd become. He just didn't want her to ever be gone. So when she left, he, like, lost his spark for a while. But he's the one that kind of puts forward the idea of becoming the new Mamiyas. His first idea was to use his writing to write a story that would kind of help plant the seed of what Mamiya was. And I think that story was the story of the Treasure Island. Like, the Treasure Island with the snowy range. The story that Mia and Haruki share. I think there's a reason why they share that story. And I think it's a story that was directed for children, but Arisugawa was told it couldn't be published. It was like he tried to tell a story that captured Mamiya as a, like, entity, essentially, but it wasn't publishable because it had a sad ending. So I think that Treasure Island is that story. And it's, like, something that they use to kind of help plant the seed of Mamiya into, like, the cult members use to kind of perpetuate the cult itself. Like, it's obvious that the others used it in some way too, because you had Haruki and Mina also familiar with the same story. Like, I think that was the clue that was telling us, like, where that connection was. It's Arisugawa, who also, you know, mentored Ryo, so Ryo also probably knows the story. In fact, Arisugawa confirms in his background that as he's, like, you know, interacting with Ryo, he encourages Ryo to read, and Ryo picks one of his at least one of his books from his shelf, like, and reads it. So, like, we know Arisugawa likely encouraged that and maybe even shared other stories. So I think Arisugawa is the source of that story, and he also was the one that proposed the idea of them perpetuating, like, Mamiya as a kind of force in the world. So he was really interesting. I think if I had to pick anybody to be the leader of the cult, it would be him. And then finally, we're going to get to Natsumi, the main character. I still don't know what Natsumi's real role is, but the thing is that's kind of freaking me out a bit is that Natsumi is kind of essentially doing exactly what Mamiya originally did. Mamiya fell in love with these people, and didn't want them to have bad endings. So he interfered. He became like an interloper, interfered in their lives, and then left as soon as he felt content that they had avoided like a terrible fate. The terrible fates being Nigaki seemed like she was going to be assaulted to potentially to death when Mamiya intervened. Toma was about to give up on his dream and go to like pursue a career that likely he was going to fail in, and maybe would lead to him like down a path of despair, and that's when Mamiya intervenes there. Samajima like was gonna like essentially kidnap and murder somebody, and so that would obviously have ended his life essentially, because he probably would have been like executed for it. And so Mamiya offered himself up as a sacrifice, saying like, hey, like do it to me instead, don't hurt any other real people, I'll teach you how to understand them. And then Arisugawa, I think, also would have been led down a road of despair if he had eventually given up on his dream of becoming a writer and just gotten a basic 9-to-5 job at like a supermarket or something, and like never finding fulfillment in anything he did. And Mamiya intervened there. You know, like we can see how Mamiya stepped in after understanding who they were a little bit by watching them, became a character who was able to interfere exactly like they needed, and then bowed out as soon as he was content that they'd moved past their like death flag, you could say. But the problem is that they'd become each dependent on Mamiya as a center core. They didn't know how to. They knew they didn't get to where they were by their own merits, and that tortured them and burned them up inside. And that was the flaw that Mamiya had. And so I think, well, I'll talk about that in a second. So Natsumi, I think, did the exact same thing. Saw his friends all going down dead ends, didn't want that to happen, attempted to intervene, but at the end of each story you can clearly see that Natsumi became a focal point for that person. Like he became so like for Minato, he became like that close friend who being the only person who knew both Minato and Mina and accepted both of them. The only person that Minato felt like he could be himself, his true self with. For Ryo, he was the outlet of his aggression. He allowed Ryo to kind of process those raw emotions that were always boiling within him and allow him to kind of vent in a way that didn't hurt other people or bring others down, which is very similar to how Mamiya was for Samajima. For Haruki, he became a friend who accepted his like Haruki for every reason but like his physical intimacy abilities, who accepted him for all his flaws and cared about him despite the fact that like Haruki didn't owe him anything, nor him like it was a mutual friendship that was devoid of any like preconceived like notions. And then Suo just needed somebody who would let him believe that like the future wasn't bleak, that there was like hope for his like ideal world and his not boring world to exist. So Natsumi essentially made himself like necessary, and that was the lesson Mamiya was teaching him at the end, was saying like, do you really think you changed anything? Like you've made them important, like you step away and it all falls apart. And he didn't even have to step away. Like Natsumi hadn't even had a chance to vanish on them before things went super south. And like that goes to show just how flawed Natsumi's dream has been, or at least his approach. Is there another way for him to go about it? I think so, but I have no idea what that is. Like, I also have no idea, like, he got the gun from the library and he has yet to use it on anything, so I'm not sure what, like, I thought he was gonna go and just cap Mamiya in the head, but I don't think that would actually have even done anything anyway. I just was surprised he didn't try. So we'll have to see how that all plays out. Maybe it's going to have something to do in the Trichiliocosm, you know, the big library. And then finally, we're going to end with Mamiya. Mamiya itself. Mamiya is odd because there's like Mamiya Prime with his like, I think it's Mamiya Tachiban. And then you have the kind of splinter Mamiyas, which are you know, the gas mask kid, the bunny head kid, the nurse girl, and the invisible entity. They all seem to be these offshoots of Mamiya, these inventions by the cult that are planted inside the hearts and minds of the, like, inheritors, you could say. And they all seem to be separate entities, although there does seem to be a much more complex, more complexity to, like, the Mamiya that we see, like, Natsumi, like, directly, like, arguing with, the one that has, like, the scarf around his neck. That Mamiya seems to be the more tangible version, but even then, like, he still seems a bit more ethereal than Natsumi does. Especially because my running theory is that the person locked in the door who was, like, shut away for being punished, like, it doesn't say it, but I think he got punished for interfering, which is why he knows how to interfere. And I'm guessing that that's actually Mamiya. But the thing is that Mamiya is somebody who just feels bad and maybe even doesn't understand how much he screwed up, you know, or at least he does, but he can't really interfere anymore. And so whatever Natsumi keeps meeting is some kind of echo of that Mamiya, of that, like, entity, wherever that person is. Because they said that he was dissolved. That seemed a little too easy. Part of me wonders if that isn't the case. Maybe his mind got wiped or something, but he's still, like, around. But, like, the Mamiya who's the scarf Mamiya seems to be functioning in this entity and kind of overseeing the work of these splinter Mamiyas, which all kind of seem lesser. They seem very focused and simple. They seem very, like, concentrated on the desires of one individual rather than somebody who seems able to walk back and forth between the stories. It's just really interesting to see that whole breakdown. And, like, I think that's the big thing that the third part's going to be about. It's going to be exploring, like, what exactly is Mamiya? Because despite the fact that this entire game was us trying to understand that, all we know is that there's a lot more going on than we originally could assume, and that there's connections there that we have no explanation for. So it's very clear. I hope we get some actual answers, but then again, like, do we need them? No, not really. I think we need to figure out what Natsumi is going to do, because obviously the things stand, it's like, it can't fly. But, like, I don't know if we're ever going to truly find out what Mamiya was, especially if, like, the source of what the Mamiyas are is, in fact, if he has been destroyed, then I don't know if we ever can. It's just this cult of Mamiya has, like, succeeded, and so maybe something has to happen there before it all fades away. Sorry, I've been talking a lot. My throat's giving out. All in all, Mamiya's story is just as sad as all the others. Mamiya started out as somebody who just wanted to help, and slowly kind of succumbed to his own madness at the futility of it all. And then the cult twisted what he was and kind of perpetuated, like, his failings. So he gets to see these, like, miniature versions of himself perpetuating his mistakes, his greatest failings. And, like, it might be implied that, like, if something doesn't change, that there will be others who are perpetuated even further. Maybe there already have been. Who says the cult hasn't, like, when they moved on from the main cast we've seen, who says they haven't already started planting seeds of Mamiya and others? So yeah, maybe this whole shared illusion is something that's going to be broadcast everywhere. So our shared illusion, indeed. Anyway, I think that's really all I have to say. Like, I think I've broken down all the major points of the story. I've talked about all the major characters. Like I said, if I were to, like, summarize it all, fantastic game. My favorite and most interactable character, I think, was Minato and Minato's story. I really liked Natsumi. His motivations made a lot of sense. And then, like, the breakdown of his failings and, like, how flawed his logic really was made a lot of sense as well. Sometimes the heroes go into their big monologue about, like, oh, you fool, how could you possibly do this? But most of the time, it's just them grandstanding or, like, talking about, like, the futility of, like, things like friendship, which is a real thing, or love, which is a real thing. But Mamiya, in this case, was just like, oh, no, you did exactly what I expected. In fact, you did exactly what I did. Thing is, you just don't understand that you're only making the problem last longer. You're only making them dependent on you, and you don't even truly exist. So what's going to happen is they're just going to go right back to where they were, if not even worse. Because look at what my people did when I tried to interfere. And it might be the reason why they were told from the beginning, do not interfere, like, only observe. Because this kind of thing is obviously not isolated, and it leaves a lot of problems. So yeah, I'm really excited to see what's coming up next. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. For those of you who are here, obviously if you're tuning in late and you missed something, or if you're listening to this later, you can always jump around and listen to whatever you want to in the future. This will be archived, and if you didn't happen to find this in the playlist with other Mamiya stuff, that's where it's going to go. I'm grateful for Fruitbat Factory again for providing this fantastic title to me. They've had my back for years now, so I'm really grateful for them. And I haven't actually been able to select the next game we're going to start covering next Friday. It's been a really challenging week for me, but the patrons should look forward to getting direct connection through me about what we're going to see next. And if you don't, for whatever reason, then I'm probably just going to be taking next Friday off because I'm struggling. I know I've got plenty of titles that we can work with, so I'll definitely narrow down the list to probably 2 or 3, and then we'll do an impromptu kind of straw poll vote in the Discord page for the patrons. Or on the Patreon itself. So yeah, thank you so much for your support. If you want to have direct say in the next title we cover on Friday and future titles, I encourage you to check out my Patreon, but there's no obligation to do anything there. Just keep in mind that not only do you get to help me select my Friday series, you also get patron casts, which I make every month, where I kind of just share my thoughts, feelings, and events that are going on in my life and the behind the scenes. And just ultimately kind of have a place where we can interact more directly. So yeah, you'll be privy to some of the exciting things coming in the future. But yeah, so it's going to be doing stuff. Oh, thank you, Indecided Ponderer. You said, man, it was a fantastic playthrough. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Sadly, I'm guessing that there's not a whole lot to compare it to. There's probably not a lot of people covering this game. I hope that changes. But I'm glad that you enjoyed it. I'm glad I was able to bring some kind of life to it. Especially because I had to do all the voice acting work, and that's always a fun ride, I'll tell you. Thankfully, I've gotten better, but it's been I'm definitely far from professional. Anyway, thank you guys so much for being here. For those of you who are watching, whether live or in post, it means the world to me. I hope to continue to make great content for this channel. I hope that we can continue to share these stories. You continue, Indecisive, you said, thank you so much for picking up the game and spreading it around as much as you did. Oh yeah, absolutely. And like I said, that's what Fridays are always going to be about. They're going to be titles you probably won't recognize. I've covered a lot of great ones that, if you liked games like this, I highly recommend trying out Seabed, Chusotsu. I did a little bard project that was really cute that was based on D&D. Gabriella STS, thank you so much. Enjoyed a lot of your commentary. Thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you so much for listening to my concluding thoughts. I enjoyed being able to share the commentary, and I look forward to doing this for a long time in the near future. So hopefully you guys stick around and continue to enjoy things. And also, like I said, look at the back catalog. There's a lot of completed series I've done if you just want something to kind of blaze through. Good opportunities there. What happens when you've been running a channel for 5 years? There's quite a backlog. So thank you so much for spending your time with me. I hopefully will see you guys in the future, and you know that we'll be back again hopefully next Friday for more series like Mamiya. And then of course every day of the week now we're doing Monday through Friday. I've got content coming out, so thank you so much. Until next video watching me, I've seen Mamiya next. I'll see you there.